Hello, I'm John Griffin. I'm with Coastal Voices. I'm taking an oral history with Jim Mitchem. It is Sunday, June 15th at 10:40, the year 2014. Jim, can you give us your full name?
Yeah, hi. I'm Jim Mitchem.
And age and date of birth?
I was born in Norfolk, Virginia, May the 24th, 1944.
Okay, and where were you raised, Jim?
In the South Norfolk section of Chesapeake.
Okay.
And lived most of my life in Norfolk, and we moved to Hatteras Island in 1998. I've been coming down here since the early 1960s.
Okay. Was that for work or for pleasure?
Pleasure.
Okay. Did you ever work down here?
Never did. I retired down here from the phone company up in Norfolk, and I retired in '94, and we moved down here permanently in '98.
Okay. Tell me about your interest in history.
Well, I've really been interested in maps all of my life, but I've also gotten involved. When you study maps, you have to know local history. You have to know about place names, and those are the sorts of things I like to preserve on the maps that I draw. I do hand-drawn watercolor maps of the Outer Banks. I have several that are in print. I have one of Ocracoke Island, one of Hatteras, several of Hatteras Island, a couple of Hatteras Village, one of Chickamacomico Banks, the three villages up there, a map of Kinnickeek, and on it I try to record a lot of place names. They're very important. If they don't get recorded on maps, they get lost.
Tell us a little bit about the basis that you use for your maps and place names.
Well, I do two-dimensional. In other words, they used to be referred to as bird's eye view maps. Like instead of doing flat line drawings that you see on most maps, I do them from a perspective like you're looking down from them from an airplane, like on a 45-degree angle, where you get the feeling of depth. And I do them in color. They're hand-drawn, watercolored, like I was telling you. And I record a lot of place names and names of different creeks, and I get all that from studying local history, old charts, and old maps.
I know of the Postal Service maps that came out in the 40s.
Mm-hmm.
How do you reference them?
Well, that's a real good question. They're really important. Back in the late 1800s, the Postal Service was establishing post offices up and down the Outer Banks, and well, they were kind of stuck with, what are we going to do here? We're going to record all these old Indian names for these different villages like Kinnickeek, Chickamacomico. No, we're going to change names, kind of like a government decision just made it for just economical purposes. And it's a real shame because we've lost names like Kinnickeek. What did we get from the post office? We got Avon, A-V-O-N. So it's just a simple spelling. Chickamacomico. I mean, what a great name. How do you replace that? You come up with names like Salvo or Waves or Rodanthe. And speaking of Rodanthe, where does that name come from? We have no idea. Is it on a whimsy from a post office employee or what? We have no idea where that name comes from. The name Trent. It used to be Trent, North Carolina, here on the Outer Banks. It's present-day Frisco. Why did they name it why did they change the name from Trent to Frisco? Well, the reason for that is when they're establishing this post office down here in Frisco, there was already a Trent, North Carolina. It's over near Newbern. So they had to come up with another name. And local legend has it that the postmaster who had been assigned here on Hatteras Island was actually from or had been stationed in San Francisco. And the post office, they're saying, no, you're not getting to San Francisco. But so they settled on Frisco, North Carolina.
Great. Postal service was in many ways a lifeline in the early days of Hatteras Island. How do you relate to that?
Well, there's another good question. You got to think about what time period we're talking about here. This is before Highway 12, right? So most of the post offices, practically all of them, were waterfront establishments. They were along docks and so forth. The post office in Hatteras Village was very close to Odin's Dock, right on the waterfront of Hatteras, right near the breakwater. There was a post office in Frisco, which was on the waterfront. It was down behind the present-day Native American Indian Museum in Frisco. The one in Buxton was behind the present-day post office on the waterfront. Matter of fact, there's a road right by the post office. It's called Mail Landing Road, and you had to go down to the waterfront. They didn't drive trucks up and down the highway. There was no highway, so they had to bring their mail in by boat. The one in Kennequet was in the village of Kennequet, very close to the waterfront, very close to the harbor, present-day harbor in Kennequet. The one up in Chickamauga was right across the street and from the Chickamauga life-saving station. So that their basic transportation was by boat. They certainly didn't drive up and down the highway in trucks.
Okay. I know you have a good story about a relative of yours that took a trip by mailboat. Could you tell us that story?
Well, I got to go back just a little bit. This is my father-in-law. His name was Lacey Wilbur Austin. He was born in 1911, and he passed away in 1992. He was living with my wife and I, his daughter, Diana, in our house in the Larchmont section of Norfolk, near Old Dominion University. His wife had passed away. Her name was Murtis Sybil Valance Austin, and she had passed away in 1991, and he just didn't want to go back home to their house at Virginia Beach, so he moved in with us. And back in the early 90s, I was driving somewhere, I'm not sure where, but we were going through downtown Norfolk, and I wanted to show him the new ballpark that the Tidewater Tides had just built. It's down close to the waterfront, downtown Norfolk. At the time, the Tidewater Tides were a farm team, or still are. At the time, though, they were a AAA team for the New York Mets. And they had just built a ball stadium there, and I wanted to show it to him. It was referred to as Met Park. So we were riding along there, and he's kind of depressed at this point. You know, he's lost his wife, and we were riding by the ballpark, and I said, I wanted to show this to you, Lacey. Riding by, and he didn't say anything. He just looked at it. And we went over some railroad tracks at the time, and Carl, boom, boom, boom. I said, there used to be a train station here, Lacey, back in the early 1900s. He turned to me, he says, yeah, I know. I rode a train from here to Virginia Beach one time. Matter of fact, we had caught a mailboat in Hatteras, rode it up to Manteo, spent the night, and then another mailboat took us to Elizabeth City, and then we went up to Norfolk and caught the train to Virginia Beach and got on a pony cart and rode it up to the lighthouse in Virginia Beach. And I thought to myself, what in the world is he talking about? Wait a minute. What did he just say? I'm saying this to myself because he didn't talk very much. And when he told that, I got to thinking, man, that's quite a story. What are you saying to me, Lacey? So I had to pull this out of him over the next couple of days and started with, well, how old were you, Lacey? He said, well, I was 6, 7 years old. So we're talking 1916, 1917, just prior to World War I. And you were with your mom? He said, yeah. And her name was Virginia Dare Austin. She was born in 1893. So she's probably about 25 years old at the time. And so you got to think about this, and I pulled this out of him. So you got on a mailboat and you went to Manio? He said, yeah, and we made several stops before we got there. So I'm thinking to myself, well, this links up with the post office thing I was just talking about. Probably got on a mailboat in Hatteras Village, probably went to Frisco, Kennekeet, up to Rodanthe, and then rode on to Manio. So she has a sister, his mother has a sister in Manio at the time, lived close to downtown. They probably spent the night right there. And got on a mailboat in Manio again and rode it up to Elizabeth City. So, Elizabeth City, you got the Pasquotank River. They probably rode that mailboat right on the Pasquotank. Got on the old Dismal Swamp Canal, which was the old intercoastal waterway. Rode it up to the lock system up in Deep Creek, that section of Chesapeake now, and came out on the southern branch of the Elizabeth River and rode it right to downtown Norfolk. There was some docks there right near where the ballpark was located, so that's probably what brought this all up to his mind. And right there was the old Bay Line. It was a steam company, a Norfolk Baltimore Packet Company. It ran freight and passenger services up to Baltimore and Philly and New York and all up and down the East Coast. So right there where that ballpark was located, it was kind of like Norfolk's version of their, I guess you could call it their Grand Central Station. It was a 4- or 5-story building. It was huge. Where they spent the night there in Norfolk, I don't know. But you got to think about it. It's a day trip from Hatteras to Manio, and a day's trip from Manio up the Dismal Swamp Canal all the way to downtown Norfolk. So now we're talking 2 days. How long does it take you to drive to Virginia Beach nowadays? 3 hours? I mean, what is it, 150 miles? So they get on a train in downtown Norfolk, and it's a straight shot all the way to the ocean front of Virginia Beach. The rail line is still there now. Norfolk has built their light rail system right along that same route, and eventually the thing will wind up taking the same route that Lacey took back in those days. Rode the train all the way to the ocean front. There was a train station down near 17th Street, down where the old Virginia Beach Dome was located. Probably got off the train there and walked over to the Coast Guard station, the old Coast Guard station in Virginia Beach, which is about 25th Street. Probably called the lighthouse in Cape Henry, and then a pony cart carries them from there all the way to the lighthouse in Cape Henry. So that 3-hour drive you took from Hatteras to Virginia Beach probably took him about 3 days, if you can imagine that. It's just, to me, that was just a fascinating story.
Thanks, Jim. Let's get back to place names. How do you go about researching where the old names came from and how they transition into the names we use today?
Well, you know, some of my maps, like I was telling you about the hand-drawn maps, I do. One of them, I have a limited edition version of the Outer Banks portion of John White's map. John White was Sir Walter Raleigh's cartographer, and he was a watercolorist. He does the very first English version map of the Outer Banks, Chesapeake Bay, and the rest of eastern North Carolina's coastline. And from that map, there are so many lessons that school kids can learn nowadays. I think this map is probably one of the most important maps in North Carolina's history. If not for this map, we wouldn't have any idea the names of the Indian tribes are located, where their locations, where the villages were located. Some of the names are survived from that, very few, but still, to give you an example, the Pamlico Sound right out here was to the Indians Minso. The Albemarle Sound just north of Roanoke Island is Weotimiot. It's names like that. If you don't record them on maps, place names like that, they tend to get lost over time. So I try to record that as names like that as much as I can. But some of the things I've learned from studying John White's map is just amazing stuff you learn. That, for example, like the name Ocracoke, where does that come from? You know, there's all kinds of legends of where the name started, but it actually started from John White's map. All John White had to go by were Indian names, right? I mean, there's no Kitty Hawk, there's no Elizabeth City, there's no Nag's Head at this time. They were just Indian names. Well, the first English recorded name for Ocracoke is Wakakan. And if you study maps from English maps from 1585 forward, you'll see that the name Ocracoke evolves from that first English spelling, Wakakan. And you'll see different spellings over time. You'll see Wakakan, Wakakok, Akakok, and eventually Ocracoke. So it's things like that that you find out when you study maps and old charts. And like I was telling you earlier, I try to record them as much as I can. There's other things that you learn from studying John White's map that are really interesting. That's like there was an inlet right where present-day Canadian Hole is located, in between Buxton and Avon, or Kinnicky. I like to refer to it as Kinnicky. And the name of the inlet was Chancandapeco. Where does that come from? Well, Sir Walter Raleigh's, and in this case, one of the people leading one of his expeditions, they're using an early Spanish map from the 1560s. Their pilot is Portuguese, and he has in his possession a 1560s Spanish map. And this name was already recorded on the Spanish map. So when John White does his map, he honors that map and carries that name over to this inlet that's located at Canadian Hole. That name probably came, the Spanish cartographer probably faced the same thing that John White did. All he had to go by were Indian names. And he's probably standing on the shores in Buxton and asking the Indians along there, what's the name of this inlet? In Spanish, of course. And the name is Chancandapeco. Things like that you learn on when you're studying old maps like this.
Excellent. How did you get the idea of using the maps as articles that people would be interested in craft shows and things like that?
Well, I've drawn maps all my life, ever since I was a little kid. I used to just make them up in my mind and draw them. Maps have always fascinated me. Reading stories like Treasure Island and old pirate maps. It's something I've always been fascinated with. And when I retired down here, it just gave me an opportunity to combine my local knowledge of history, my love of maps, and my ability to draw and paint. So I've kind of brought it all together in my maps.
Great.
I'll tell you one other story about this, the John White map.
Oh, absolutely.
Well, John White, like I was telling you earlier, did this very first English version map of the Outer Banks. And maps at that time, in the late 1500s on up through the 1600s, were very, very important. I mean, we're talking about knowledge here. We're talking about military advantages. Most of these maps became the possession of the British Royal Crown. John White's map has been in possession of the British Royal Museum since the 1860s, 1866, I believe it was. They've had this map in their possession. On this map, very recently, just in the past couple years, they have found out some brand new information that we never knew before. This is really brings out the importance of studying old maps. So we're talking about 16th century knowledge, right, and technology, and the ability of the cartographer to record things. And when they made mistakes, they didn't have whiteout, they didn't have Photoshop, so how did they make corrections? Well, if they had a mistake on a hand-drawn map, they would put a patch on it and write over top of it. One of the things that that was in the recent studies of John White's map is a patch that's located, well, it's at the confluence of the Roanoke River and the Chowan River and the Albemarle Sound. If you think about Route 17, when you're coming down from Chesapeake and you travel in that area, you'll cross over the bridge of the Chowan River, and on the left-hand side, there's this patch on the map that I'm talking about. So, like I was telling you, they would use those to cover mistakes, and they'd also use them to cover information they didn't want anybody else to know about. This map was due for publication and sold commercially. So there was a patch over this place, and somebody asked the question, what's under the patch? Just in the past couple of years, what's under the patch? And the British Museum says, well, we have no idea. So they hold the map up to a light box, and under the patch is a drawing of a fort, or a map icon, you would call it, a symbol for a fort. What's the significance of that? Well, if you go back to John White's writings, you'll see that the reference to the lost colony, one of the references to the lost colony is they moved 50 miles into the Main. 50 miles into the Main. What is that? Well, that means 50 miles into the mainland. And if you look at a map, present-day map, and you go 50 miles west of Roanoke Island, you'll come to this spot. Very close to 50 miles. Did the lost colonists move there? We have no idea. Did they move to Croatoan, which is actually the island of Hatteras and Buxton? We have no idea. So maps can tell you a lot of different stories if you study them the way I do and just kind of put two and two together. You'll learn a lot of things.
Jim, thank you very much. That was great, and you've done a lot of research, and even research for this interview, so I appreciate that. Is there anything else that you want to say about maps? Well, I have another question.
Sure.
I know you took the postal maps and made some corrections on them. Could you speak to how you decided that they had some things wrong?
Oh yeah, I could sure tell you that story. This is real quick. There's a fellow who still lives up in Kennebec today, and Manson Meekins is one of the most knowledgeable people I've ever met in my life. He's, I don't know, 95, 96 years old now. And I've known him for years. He was a friend of my father-in-law, Lazy Austin. And he was telling me one time that he used to make maps when he was a youngster in the Coast Guard. And you know, he's stationed up in New York, he's stationed in Philadelphia, he's stationed all over. And one of the ways he kept himself entertained was to think about home, and he'd do these little hand-drawn maps. of Kennekeek. Just keep in touch with the folks back home and just things to bring his memory back to Kennekeek and the place that he loved. And I was looking at all these maps that he'd had, and sat down with him on a couple of interviews I did with him a couple years ago with these old postal maps, and I went over with him and asked him, there's places I'd heard about that I didn't know where they were in or near Kennekeek. I'd ask Manson, where are the White Hills? And he'd look at the old map and he'd point it out. He said, right here. And I would mark it down on that map. I said, how about the Little Hills? It's right here. He'd point it out. I'd mark it on the map. And these are two little places that are just north of Little Kennekeek Station. And I'd ask him different questions like that. What about this place called Black Hammock? It was located right there in Kennekeek, just behind the Food Lion. He says, that's wrong. And I have to go by exactly what Manson's telling me. He knows what he's talking about. He knows this area so well. He says the Black Hammock is actually located up in Kennekeek. I'm sorry, up in Salvo, in that area. And I break that map out, and he shows me where it is. And so Manson Meekins is a tower of knowledge, and I tried to record as much of it as I can from him, and that's what I'm basing my Avon map on today.
Excellent. Thank you. Anything else that you would want to add, Jim? I think this is great information, and I think people are going to like it a lot.
Well, the last thing I'd like to leave you with is this John White map. Everything comes back to John White. I'd love to see a curriculum in the high schools and grammar schools, as far as that goes, in their geography courses. If they're still teaching geography nowadays, I certainly hope so. I hope they would. I would wish that they would pass along some of this information in their geography courses and study that John White map as much as they possibly can.
And attached to this interview is a copy of the John White map. Thanks, Jim. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John.